Our guest this week is Jessie. Now, Jessie is a woman of many talents. She is a back-end engineer at CyberSafe. She is co-host of the Glowing in Tech podcast, which I'm sure we'll come to talk about. She's also doing a part-time master's in computer science at the University of Bath, and most importantly, she came to her first codebar workshop in March 2021. Welcome to the show, Jessie.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
You are very welcome. We have so many questions for you, but I suppose the first one I want to ask you is tell me about Glowing in Tech, the podcast.
So it started in probably, I think around 2022. Myself and Amber were part of the Coding Black Females community, Code Bar, a lot of awesome communities where in person we were getting to see a lot of people from diverse backgrounds doing their thing and absolutely killing it in technical careers. But then when it came to looking online and consuming content on technical concepts and, teaching ourselves things, it was really hard to find that content from people that look like us. And we kind of felt like we were part of this bubble of incredibly talented women, black women, but they themselves were not available to everybody else as much as the dominant kind of groups within tech. So we wanted to change that. And so the first season was us just like essentially platforming some incredible black women and their careers and all the things that they've learned in a hope to kind of improve that representation. And it's grown from there. We're just about to start our third season now, focusing on like startup life specifically, and how diverse founders are finding the kind of tech startup world. Yeah.
I love the idea behind the podcast. And, this is a fairly new podcast. So, do you have any advice for us on starting a podcast and, interviewing and speaking with guests?
I think for us, the main thing has been like the guests that we find are people that we are really excited to talk to and really excited to talk about. Sometimes we've kind of been shooting our shot to people that should not have replied to us, but we were kind of like, it would be amazing if we love your work. And then when they say yes, and it's like, oh my God, I get to, it's like for selfish reasons, sometimes the conversations that we get to have. And I think just that, like pursuing it with excitement, because everybody can feel that excitement when you're having that recording, when you're speaking to that person.
That's amazing. I know exactly the feeling. Kim and I have had a few of those, chancing our arm, inviting people on the show. So you said there that it started with coding black females, and obviously we love to champion other communities on this show. Is that how you found Code Bar? How did that work kind of sequentially?
Yeah, so I think it was pandemic time. I just kind of discovered the concept of it's possible to make that transition from a non-technical role into a technical role. So I was trying to consume everything I could online, how to do it, who are the people that have done it, where do we go to kind of meet a group of people. During the pandemic, there was that whole 100 days of code kind of movement as well. So just the whole idea of building in public and finding people to do things with online, and that was the way I found Coding Black Females, and that was the way I found Code Bar, and really kind of understanding that there were networks of people that were willing to donate their time and expertise and support you in making that journey, I think was everything I needed during that period of time to be able to do it. Like there's so many people that were part of that transition for me that yeah, it was definitely like community driven learning.
How
I love
interesting. And just before we move on, could you explain what 100 Days of Coding is for the... I could see Kim was nodding as you said it, but I was clueless. So could you just explain what that is?
Yeah, so it was on Twitter. It was basically people encouraging each other to code for 100 days straight. And so each day you'd be like day 21 of 100 days of code, and you would post like a concept you'd learned or the thing you'd built that day. And it was like a big, people would search for the hashtag and you interact with everybody else doing it. And it was like a really lovely moment for all the non-techies trying to kind of egg each other on. There's definitely like a bit of a joke of like who made it to day 100. I know that I started and failed a couple of times, but it was during that like peak moment, I think, where it felt like there was a lot of us from non-techie backgrounds trying to help each other out and support each other, and just like kindness with strangers was just a really nice time on Twitter.
I love that. And you started touching on it, your journey and when it started, which was during the pandemic. And a big part of this podcast is diving deep into that journey. So I want to take you back to the pandemic, when you started your transition into tech. So at what point did you think, oh, tech could be a career for me? Was there like one moment or something that happened that made you think, I'm going to pursue this?
So, yes, I studied psychology at university, and up until the point I graduated, I was all about pursuing things I was interested in. I had no idea of what career I wanted after that, and that was kind of for me and the family, I was the first in my family to go to university. I didn't have the kind of this is how you plan for a career aspect. My mum was just extremely happy and proud that I got that far. So when I graduated, I was like, oh, this is as far in my life as I've planned. I don't know what I'm going to do next. And I was teaching for a while as a teaching assistant in a primary school, helping children who had special educational needs or were new to the country. And so we're learning English as a second language. And I absolutely loved that. But it wasn't a career that I could progress any further in. I didn't have the PGCE. So it was kind of like I either need to go back to university and like commit to this teacher thing, or what else can I do that's kind of psychology related? And I happened to come across the place I work at now, CyberSafe, behavioral science, cybersecurity startup, and it felt like just about tangentially related to my degree that it was like, I'm using my psychology background. So I started a marketing role there, then transitioned into customer success, and that was when I got to work with the developers and chat through bugs, and actually like the first time I'd interacted with an engineer and understood that that was a job role. It's just not something I'd really thought about before that point. And it was not long before the pandemic that the engineers did like a little introduction to Python course. It was just like an evening a week for 5 weeks, giving us the basics. A few of us in the company did it. And by the end, we'd produced like a little script that did some things, like understood some of the foundational concepts. And it's like, damn, this is really fun. This is so cool. I had no idea that it was like this. I'd always had this understanding what I did imagine a programmer would look like as someone that had studied computer science at university, really good maths whiz, incredible kind of like, studied their whole life with this technical background. And all of a sudden, I've been shown that in just a few weeks, you can build a pretty good, like I guess, a proof of concept for a feature. And it was like, okay, maybe this is possible. And that was when I started doing all the Googling and figuring out how to do it, because I was hooked from that point, I'd say.
It sounds quite similar to something that happened to me in my final year at uni, where my degree was quite like design and coding. Like it was a Bachelor of Arts, like not a Bachelor of Science. And we actually had an external app development company come in. And for 6 weeks, I remember it was a Monday evening for 6 weeks, and we built an app, and we gradually progressed, and this app got better and better every week. And then I think it was like week 5 we like integrated an API, and I remember then at the end of it having this, it was essentially like a BBC News app, and I was thinking, this is so cool, like I built this, like this is something that I could do. And I think also because it was on my phone, I was like, I could build something that people use. This is so cool. And then that was for me the moment where I was like, okay, the coding and building element is definitely for me, not the design. And it's amazing, exactly like you said, like just those evenings of like consecutive weeks, how much of an impact it can have.
100%. And like the realization moment, I'm so excited that you had a similar thing where it's like, I can build this thing. It's like you're putting all these Lego pieces together and you see the end product and you're like, it is possible to do it without necessarily all of the background and academic rigor that the dominant, I guess, route we see for software engineers to be the case.
And so then did you then go to your manager like internally at CyberSafe and say, like I know I'm doing marketing, but actually like I really think I want to do this coding. Like, can I transition internally? Because that's so exciting.
Yeah, I'm super grateful because they definitely took a gamble. It was from that point, pandemic times, I did the Sky Get into Tech boot camp. So that was 4 evenings a week for, I want to say 3 or 4 months, and putting together a full stack application and a bit more of like, I guess, depth to building. And that was primarily like Python and JavaScript. So I definitely had some more, like I was definitely closer to being work ready, but I think they definitely took a chance on taking me that junior and allowing me to transition. And I think it's because one of the things I think allowed me to make that transition was the fact that I had demonstrated I was capable in a non-technical role and kind of built those relationships with technical stakeholders. I was working closely with engineers, so I had some context. And I came in with the product knowledge, right? I wasn't starting from scratch on understanding what the software was. I was very familiar with the software. So I think that was a way for me to make that transition. It was still definitely like off a cliff starting that first day, but it was, I think, a lower cliff to jump from.
And I think it's really nice that, you know, the company allowed you to do that. And, you know, we don't often hear that many companies allow people internally to make that transition, because it is quite a big jump, you know, marketing to tech. And like you said, it is a gamble, you know, because it may not have worked. And I really like that they allowed you to do that, because they obviously saw your passion. And like you said, you showed that you were capable because you were flourishing in your current job. And so I wish I could hear more stories of companies allowing people to do that, because I think it is a really good way to transition into tech, is that if you are already in a tech company, actually moving internally is a really good route into tech. And it's really nice, actually, you're the first guest who has taken that journey on the podcast. So it's really nice to hear of that journey that you've done.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of investment into, I think it's something also that comes a little bit easier with a startup. There is slightly more flexibility and slightly less less structure into how people interact. I was sat next to the engineers all day at work, so they knew me, and had been part of some of the projects that they were part of, albeit in a non-technical capacity. I think really like building that rapport and having that connection and relationship. And yeah, like you said, like being able to show people that there's a passion goes a very long way.
So now you're a back-end engineer. Can you tell us what that entails?
Yeah, so I'm on the platform squad, and typically what a platform engineer or platform squad does is they're in charge of putting in place the fundamental architecture that all of the other engineers will be working off of. So it's a lot of implementing like database technologies, and yeah, getting the right infrastructure in so that we're monitoring alerts and making sure that when things are really high capacity, we're dealing with that, and just essentially like building the tools for the other devs to build software, as well as some feature work. I still also build some of the APIs and things. Yeah, but it's a really fun role. I really love platform engineering, and I don't think it gets as much hype as it should, because you're kind of got your finger in a lot of the pies across the what's being built in the software. And it's really nice as well to be kind of part of a very varied set of projects.
And you mentioned the word squad. And I just want to touch on that quickly, because I'm from Southampton. So the Southampton Kim thinks of squad of like a group of people that I went to school with who would like be causing trouble on like, you know, outside a shop on like a Friday night. But also I know, you know, there's a technical term for it as well. So could you just tell us what, you know, the technical term for squad means, please?
Yeah, of course. That's such a good point. I think it comes from the Spotify. I think it was Spotify that introduced the squad model. And it's essentially like, rather than having a back end team and a front end team and a product team, well, those departments still exist, but you're put into smaller units of a combination of those skill sets. So you'll have a front end engineer, a back end engineer, a product manager, a designer, a content person, a UX person, and you are your own squad that can essentially like, you have everything in your team to deliver a fully fledged feature from beginning to end. So there's no kind of, oh, I need to go and speak to the backend team about how to implement this API, because we're all in the same room all the time. So we're together planning, delivering, testing, and releasing a feature. I think it's a really nice way to have like a really close-knit team. There are some drawbacks to the squad model, and there's like debate as to whether it's the best way, but I've really enjoyed that kind of interdisciplinary way of working, because then you're exposed to all the different skill sets and how those people think.
I really like the way that it just encourages collaboration, because I've worked at companies where, you know, the engineers just sit together, they don't collaborate with like the designers, you know, the product owners. And you know, I've worked at companies where the squad model is in place, and you know, having all these technical skills and, you know, knowledge in the team makes for a really powerful end result. And it's just the collaboration element I actually really like. And otherwise, as you know, I've been at companies as well where, you know, like I say, the engineers just work together, and that can actually be quite isolating, because you just kind of get given, you know, your task at the end, and you're kind of often the last person to know what's happening. So you're like, oh well, I kind of wish I'd had a bit of an input into how this feature would end up. And so that element for me, I've always really liked.
Yeah, 100%. I've had some nightmare stories of, yeah, it going through that entire process, reaching the engineers, and then the engineers being like, who told you this was possible? And then it has to go all the way back to the beginning again.
And it just takes a long time if you've got to go all the way back and start the whole process again.
So you and Kim have just had a conversation about how there's different kinds of developers and are in different teams, and they can be called squads and they can be called something else. For people that aren't technical, you said you're a back-end engineer. Have you always been a back-end engineer? Can you move between being a front-end engineer and a back-end engineer? I genuinely have no idea. Law is completely different. So if it's a very obvious answer, feel free to say, but that was just my question.
No, it's not obvious at all. I think typically the way that people tend to learn as well and get introduced to it is that you kind of train in a full stack way, meaning that you learn about the front end and the back end. And I think that's a great thing to do because you can figure out which one you prefer. So the front end typically is like everything the user sees when they interact with an app or a website. And the back end is the thing that is accessing the data and bringing that to the front end to present in a lovely, user-friendly way. So I think for me, I really love the back end because there is a really fun, like troubleshooting element to the way that you're storing data, manipulating data. Like I love the whole back end side of, yeah, like orchestrating large amounts of information and that all the problem solving aspects that come with that. I'm also very, very bad at front end development because I really struggle with like the syntax and everything with JavaScript. I just find it can be so complicated. But then I know front end devs say the same thing about the back end. So I definitely think there's like a preference thing depending on how your brain works and what it is you enjoy. And then full stack, I've worked with some incredibly talented full stack developers who do both. And essentially they could deliver a feature from idea to production because they can do the back end and the front end. But that is a kind of wizardry that I'm not capable of. And you tend to also be slightly less specialized in either aspect if you're kind of doing both. But I can do a little bit. I've done some front end bits in the past. It's just a bit of a like context switch that can be costly in terms of like cognitive load if you try and do too many things at once.
Okay, so what I'm getting from that is it is possible, and some people do both, but most people develop their own preference kind of based on how their brain works.
Yeah, and like what your interests are, like a lot of what I think makes a great developer is how much you're learning and how much your kind of learning is driven by your passion. So naturally you might end up veering towards one, but you might also just be really interested in learning both of those things. For me, I found a niche that I really enjoyed, and that's what's led me to being a back-ender.
And, for anyone listening who's, thinking of entering tech, it can sometimes be quite overwhelming with what direction to go in. Like, do I do front end? Do I do back end? Do I do full stack? Do I do data? What advice would you have for anyone just starting out and deciding what route to go down?
I think always remember that the decision you make right now is subject to change. You can change your mind at any point because I know a lot of people are like, oh, if I commit to this, then I'm closing off this option. If I specialize too early in front end, I'll never do back end. I know incredible engineers that have done both at various points in their career. So I would say just follow your interests. Where do you find yourself naturally leaning towards, like going down those rabbit holes and trying to understand some of those concepts and follow that. There's also even if you started a front end role at a company, it's a lot easier once you're in to make that switch to back end at some point. So yeah, I think don't put so much pressure on yourself to like commit to one because you could do either or both, or it's never too late to switch.
I guess what you're saying is the main thing is just to start learning. And then, hopefully it will figure itself out. Or at any point you can change, it's okay.
Yeah, I think so. I think follow your passions and like that's the best way I learn is to do it through things I'm interested in, and that will naturally lead you to something that you, I guess, specialize in.
And like you said, you might also prefer something. And generally, I think if you enjoy something, you'll do it more. And if you do something more, you will get better. So actually, if you just play around and just, keep doing the thing that you're doing, you will find the thing that you really enjoy. And then when you enjoy it, you'll do it more and then you'll get really good.
Yeah. So I think something else that can help with figuring that out is like trying to not to get overwhelmed by it, but try and understand the trends in how that area of tech is changing. Like for example, with front end, there's like always a lot of developments in the frameworks and kind of quite often a competition in like which one's preferred, and like understanding those debates and getting into like the research behind why do people prefer Next? Why do people not like Next.js, which is a framework on top of React? Those kind of things can help inform if you're interested in understanding that technology.
So you've just talked about how you think people should kind of follow what they enjoy. What other advice would you give to aspiring developers?
I think go to events and attend community things. Like I say, it's the only reason I was able to do what I did. And it's because of not just like the inspiration and motivation you get from being around people that have done it and the people that are doing it, but just that sense of community is like a real lifeline on the days that things do feel a little bit too difficult. And you have that reassurance and that, I guess, affirmation that things get easier. Because especially on in your career and in the journey to making that transition, the amount of knowledge seems insurmountable. You can get very easily overwhelmed by how much there is to learn. And I think it's only through the context of being exposed to people that have done it and are doing it that you realize that it isn't all needed. You don't need to know everything. Even the best developers in the world don't know everything. We're all using Google a lot of the time when we don't understand something. So like getting those hints and tips and the kind of strategies that people use to overcome those difficult moments. I think that's something I learned through community. So that would be my tip, is engage in community as much as you can.
That's interesting. And actually, just a sneaky question there. If a developer is stuck, what's your top tip? Is it Google it? Is it, the old-fashioned way, or is there a resource that you think you should point them towards?
Uh, I've really been loving Claude AI recently, the Anthropic LLM. I think it's a great I love ChatGPT and Gemini are amazing, but Claude feels like hyper specific to coding. And it's not about necessarily asking it to do the work for you, but asking it to explain how something works or how to improve something and then give you the reasoning why. It's like you have a pair programmer with you. You've got someone, a senior engineer sat with you explaining why you could do this in a more efficient way. That's like a massive performance gain that I would have loved to have had earlier on in my career, but I'm also really enjoying having now. If there's a problem that you are struggling to find, because Google, sometimes your problems are hyper specific to the exact use case you're trying to do, and then you're stuck trying to find a thread of somebody doing it in the exact same way. And that's where I think LLMs are amazing because they can tailor it to that very specific use case.
I love that you touched on, developers don't know everything, because actually sometimes people that want to coach at codebar, and they can be really experienced developers, the thing they say is, oh, what happens if someone asks me a question and I don't know the answer? And for some reason that seems to be like quite a big fear of people, and it often can stop them coaching. And actually, like you said, like knowing what to Google and going down the route of trying to problem solve is actually a big part of being a developer. Like, we don't know the answers to everything. Like there are so many JavaScript syntax things that I've been writing it for 12 years and I still have to Google every single time. So actually one of the things I often say to those people is, if someone asks you a question, so let's take a codebar workshop, if the student asks you a question, whether you know the answer or don't know the answer, show them how you would work it out, because in the long run that process is way more beneficial than just saying, oh well, the answer is blah blah blah, because that's actually not really teaching the student anything. And actually then the student will never know if you do know the answer or not, because actually you're going to go down the same journey every single time and show them how you would work it out, because that is such a big part of being a developer, is knowing what to Google, knowing how to problem solve, and it is such a big part of it. So I really like that you touched on that.
100%. I've definitely been an instructor on courses where I've been asked a question I don't know, and it is great to say, I don't know the answer, but let's figure it out together. And then everybody gets, like you said, like an insight into the ways to figure it out, because that in itself is, yeah, a massive building block for becoming a developer.
And also just say, and also it's okay to say you don't know, we're not robots, we're not ChatGPT, we're not Google. And actually I think, when you've got that student coach dynamic, you know, often the students think like, oh, this coach knows everything, you know, they're a machine. And actually, I think there's something incredibly powerful as the coach saying, do you know what, actually, I don't know, but let's work it out together, because that's incredibly useful. And I think it's also really important, you know, when you're interviewing as well, you know, if there's anyone listening who's, you know, starting an interview or going for a tech interview, you know, there's something incredibly powerful about saying, do you know what, I don't know actually, but this is what I would Google. Because I mean, I've definitely sat in interviews where I know that person doesn't know the answer and I know they're just waffling, and that almost annoys me more, whereas I'd rather that person admit they don't know, because we are human, you know, we don't know everything.
Yeah, yeah, 100%.
So this is a question we always forget to ask at the start. So we've talked about you're now a developer, and before that you were a teaching assistant. What did you actually want to be when you grew up?
I think the thing I wanted to be for the longest time was a film director. Absolutely obsessed with cinema and studied film studies at A level. And then I found psychology, and that became my new hyperfixation. But yeah, film and cinema.
Wow, that's so interesting. We had another guest also say director, so maybe we're onto something here.
Amazing. That whole passion of wanting to build something, right? And the creative element as well.
And I do think it does kind of relate as well to what you do, because you know you do also a lot of public speaking. So actually, you know, as a director, you know, you're orchestrating things, you're kind of in charge, and actually you do public speaking. So I think it, you know, it's not the same, but there is a similarity there, I think, with you know what you do today.
100%. And I think it's a misconception that coding, even back-end engineering, isn't a creative thing. There's so much creativity that goes into figuring out the solution to a thing, or even like interpreting requirements and then like what you're presenting as the end result. I still feel like I get to do a lot of the creative stuff that I've always enjoyed doing.
I love that you said coding is creative, because it's often, you know, the conversation I have as well. People go, "Oh, well, aren't you just kind of sat behind your computer all day?" And I'm like, "No, no, no. Like, it is actually incredibly creative. You know, I do predominantly front end. You know, I don't do back end, and I, you know, like the visual side of it. You know, when you can do like animations, I'm like, that's so creative. You know, you go to Hack Day and like build robots and all of this stuff. Like, it's so creative. I got my nephew a couple of Christmases ago. There's a thing called a makey makey, and it's kind of it's like a children's introduction to hardware, and you've got these little crocodile clips that you like attach to fruit, and then you make like a little musical instrument. And I'm like, see, coding is creative and fun.
Oh my God, that's amazing. That's so cool. 100%, 100%. And I'm glad you brought up hack days as well, because hackathons and the idea of having like a time restriction on delivering a proof of concept for something is such a good way to get a just like a big hit of creativity, because it's all about how can you make something, even if it doesn't do the thing completely and fully well, how can you show and demonstrate that it has the potential to do it.
Yeah, there's definitely something about like the intense environment of like, right, we've got 24 hours, like we need to just build this thing. And the really nice thing is about a hack day is like no one's project is ever perfect or done, but you've learned so much in that, you know, time frame of just like building this thing really quickly. And it's often so different to like a work environment where, you know, you're building this thing that has to be production ready. You know, hack days, you're literally hacking something together, but it's almost like as a developer, it's quite a relief to just have that freedom of this doesn't have to be perfect and I like it.
100%,
You're
100%.
not going to have any testers going, that test has failed or that thing's not working.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, we've loved this chat. And so before, you know, we let you go, how can people find you online?
So feel free to connect and reach out to me on LinkedIn I'm Jessie Auguste with an E on the end. And also the podcast, so Glowing in Tech, available on all podcast platforms.
We will make sure to put a link to that in the video description, podcast description, however you are consuming this today. But thank you so much, Jessie, for coming along and speaking to us today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jessie. It was an absolute pleasure.